Okay, well, why don't we first introduce ourselves? I'm Fred Matt, president of FX Matt Brewing Company, Saranac Beer, Utica Club, and we have the Flying Bison Brewery out in Buffalo. I went back to my family's business about 33 years ago. We were virtually out of business, and we successfully built the business back up. One of the things I first did was rebuild our distribution channel, and so we've gone from just at one point we had 18 beer distributorships that we owned. We ultimately sold all those in the kind of the 50s, 60s, 70s, which hindsight, that's probably the more profitable side of the business. I figure if we had those beer distributorships today, we'd be a $1 billion company. We are not a $1 billion company. You know, the side we chose was great, and working with distributors can be a good experience, and it can be a trying experience. The thing I'd say in general is when you're working with a distributor, two things. You both have the same goal. You want to sell more cases. And so if you cannot get along when you have a mutual goal that's advantageous to succeed with, there's a problem. I'd also tell you when a lot of times people want to get out of a distributorship, I would say love the one you're with. You know, if you are with a distributor and only 2 people of 20 are selling your beer, that's 2 more than the place you leave or go to when you leave. So, you know, I think that at the end of the day, I also am fond of saying, what's the difference between a good distributor and a bad distributor? A hot brand. If your brand sells, they will sell it. If it doesn't sell, they're not going to sell it. So I'm going to let these guys introduce themselves, and then we can ask some questions and kick some topics around. So who's next? You want?
I'll go next. I'm Marc Schulz from Prison City Brewing, and you're probably wondering why a guy that just opened a Deutsche Brewery a year ago is sitting here talking about distribution. Real quickly, my background is my entire career started at a distributor up in Saranac, Lake Placid. That's now High Peaks, part of the great family, I believe. Then went on to be a sales rep for Boston Beer, St. Adams for about a decade. I was a sales manager at Ithaca Beer for a few years and craft brand manager at TJ Sheehan, 4 years managing all craft brands from Syracuse to Buffalo, all points north and south. So why I'm here. Plus, someone wasn't going to make it. Palfreyman needed a body.
And what a body it is. Brendan Palfreyman, I'm an attorney. Sorry about that. But yeah, I worked for around 250 breweries, mainly New York, but also around the country. We worked a bunch of issues. And a lot of it's distribution contracts, both the birth and the death of them. They are a lot like marriage, and like any marriage, if it breaks up, the divorce usually gets ugly. So as Fred said, if you can make it work and you want to save your kids, sometimes it's best to try and stay in there. But if you can't, then you got to try and fight your way out. And yeah, looking forward to what everybody has to say. We got great.
I'm Grieco. I'm also an attorney in Buffalo. Work with a number of breweries across New York State, including working on distribution agreements. And my experience, I think, is probably pretty similar to Brendan's in that regard. Although I primarily, actually, at least began, and still I should say primarily do licensing and regulatory stuff for most of my clients. But one of the great things, I guess, about working in this industry is you really become sort of a small business lawyer, which lets you wear a bunch of different hats, and that includes getting involved in agreements, including distribution agreements, which some of you probably already know, and some of you are probably getting the sense that they can be fraught, they can be difficult, and that's why, I'll tell you right now, you probably hear this almost every time you sit through one of these presentations that involve lawyers, that the takeaway message is consult your lawyer or a lawyer before you sign on these agreements. And that generally is true, and I think it's generally good advice, but it's really, really good advice. I think in this context, these contracts are not like most contracts that you're going to be entering into or have entered into because there's a statutory clause over them that frankly is there primarily to, I mean, it's not as bad as it used to be, but a lot of the statutory provisions and the difficulty in getting out of them is to protect the distributor, not to protect you. So you really do need to know what you're signing before you sign it, and there are lawyers, people like Brennan, people like myself, other lawyers who can help you understand what those terms are and try to negotiate a better deal. And so we're just going to try to have sort of a roundtable type of discussion on some of these issues. I did not. I was listed as the presenter on this. I didn't prepare a formal presentation. That's partly because I really wanted to thank these guys, thank Paul, and thank Brendan in particular for, I almost wasn't able to come here today because of a medical emergency in my family. It's actually been resolved well. That's partly the reason why I didn't put together a PowerPoint. Frankly, I don't think we need a PowerPoint. I think we'll have a better discussion here if we just talk about some of these issues. And we've got sort of an outline of things that we think we can touch on, but absolutely also here to answer your questions and hear from your experiences of issues you've dealt with distributors. I think will make for a more interesting session here anyway. So
let's just get a read on the room. So how many people right now distribute? If you raise your hands. And how many of it is self-distribute versus with a beer distributor? And then this is self. Okay, and then how many are beer distributors? Okay, and then, yeah.
Exclusively, because the other question I think would be a little bit of doing a little bit of both, which you certainly can do.
So, does anybody have any burning question? Because when you come to these things, it's always nice if you have a burning question that we can deal with first. Otherwise, we can wing it. In the back.
The fair market value of a buyout? Is that negotiable?
Jumping right in.
I'm going to let the lawyers deal. I'll tell you what I do with those. And honestly, I live by love the one you with, and we don't have distributor contracts, just for the record. Chris was, I think, taken back by that. We do have county agreements, so we do sign county agreements, but we had a lawyer years ago, Marc Rodman, who was famous because he beat Budweiser, and his contract was so one-sided, I just said, I'm not doing this. And I think a contract should be fair and balanced. For any of those that have signed the Sheehan contract in this room, God love you, because that is the most one-sided fucking thing I've ever seen in my life. Yeah, well, I'm with Manhattan, and I don't sign them. So, I would say fair market value, and we've only made 3 distributor changes in the 30 years I've been there, is fair market value is I let the distributors fight it out. And, so right now, you can hear anything from 5 to 8 times gross. But, it all depends on what the distributor thinks it's worth and what the other distributor is willing to pay. So I'll let the lawyers take it from there. But.
Oh, sure. So I will say with Fred, and again, that may be, Matt's not entering into agreements, maybe fall into that exception because they've been around long enough that it precedes that requirement. But just to be clear, the ABC law does mandate written agreements between brewers and distributors. So for all of you folks who are newer, the statute does specify that agreements, that there'll be a written agreement for the sale from a brewer to a retailer. The fair market value is an important issue that was added to the statute that was supposed to help balance out a little bit. And let me back up, and I apologize for backing up a little bit before getting directly to that issue, to understand why those protections, those statutory protections, are in the ABC law. And historically, it's because the industry looked completely different at the time that statute was written, where the breweries had all the power, the very big breweries, and And the distributors, many of which were, multi-generational family businesses, did, and they risked investing a lot of money into marketing beer for those big breweries, and felt they needed protection if those big breweries just walked on them. And they got those protections through almost every state legislature in the country. And unfortunately, a lot of those laws are still on the books the way they were written, with some changes, and the fair market value is one of those changes. To reflect that the fact that now, in most cases, those distributors are much larger companies than your companies. There should be more changes, in my opinion, to make it even more reflect the reality of the relative bargaining power. But, so a few years ago, one of the changes was so previously you could only get out of one of these distribution agreements for cause. And for cause was defined in the statute under pretty limited circumstances. So you were really stuck with the distributor unless you could, in those narrow circumstances where you could establish cause, and I'm sure we'll talk about that because that cause is still an important concept for potentially getting out of an agreement. But there was a provision added to the ABC law that allowed you to get out of, if you were below a certain size, and it's a fairly high threshold, almost everybody in here, I'm sure pretty much everybody in here would qualify for this, 300,000 barrels, that you can get out of a contract without cause. But the trade-off is you have to pay the distributor the fair market value of those distribution rights. And that's all it says in the statute. And although it defines the term fair market value, is basically what an objective buyer would pay and an objective seller would accept. And that's essentially all it says. So if that's all it says, if your agreement says nothing about fair market value, or if it just repeats the statutory definition, it's essentially, we'll figure it out later, is what it means. Because if you don't agree on that issue, the statute requires you to go to arbitration, which essentially is going to be a trial on that issue. And you have experts, and it's going to be lots of fun. So one of the recommendations, and what I try to do with these agreements, is try to come to an agreement as to what that fair market value is going to be, and that can change over time, or at least a formula, something to give you some idea, to have some basis to calculate that. But I've dealt with, I've tried to get out of agreements, or had, advised clients getting out of agreements that didn't have that defined, and that becomes a huge issue. But it really is not defined unless you put it in the agreement.
Yeah, I agree. If you, as Chip said, if you just leave it at fair market value or don't say anything, it's, left to industry practice, which typically winds up being a multiple of the gross profit the distributor made over the trailing 12-month period. As Fred said, the distributors are often seeking 5 to 7x, which I find is crazy. I'll try to, so as Chip mentioned, in the contract, depending on the size of the brewery, I'll either try to define it ahead of time and give it something like, you negotiate. You start with like a 2x multiple, maybe up to 3, 3.5, and then you try to do something like no more than in the contract, so that it's ceiling for the fair market value, not the actual fair market value. Because if you're trying to leave a distributor, odds are that your sales have been plummeted. In which case, you have to go back to the definition. The only definition in the law is that what a willing buyer would pay and what a willing seller would sell for. And you would argue to the distributor, well, who would buy this with your efforts in the sales decreasing? And you can be as creative as you want in the contract. You could say it's a multiple, it's 3x. You could say it's no more than 3x. You could say if sales are flat, it's 2x. If sales are going up, it's 5x. If sales are going down, it's 2x. You could tier it. You could say if you surpass a certain case equivalent threshold in a year, it's this much. If this many CEs, then the multiple's a little bit higher. You can even try to say, like I've had at least 1 or 2 breweries where they've had sort of honeymoon periods where there's no fair market value buyout for the first year, which usually the brewer forgets about it for the year, then they call me at like 13 months. I'm sorry. But yeah, I think that's. And one other thing, like there's nothing in the law that says it has to be a multiple of gross profit. And I get approached by valuation experts all the time saying that's a ridiculously simplistic way to look at it. So if it's an important enough contract and it's there's enough at stake there. There are all sorts of accountants and independent valuation experts that could say, this is how businesses are bought and sold all the time. Distribution rights for everything, bought and sold all the time. There are way more nuanced ways of looking at this that take into account sales decreasing or sales increasing on market size and type of thing, rather than just 4x gross profit. But I think one thing that might be useful for people to hear from Marc's perspective is a lot of times when breweries are starting out, they're going to self-distribute, and then at some point that becomes too unwieldy, and they have to think about when it makes sense to actually sign one of these contracts. And Marc had these unique experiences on the distributor and the brewer side. I have some insight there.
So one thing that, and this will be great to hear from Marc, but one thing I think you ought to think about when you're listening to Marc is this Marc Rodman, who is very famous. One of the points he made, and I'll never forget this, there's one time that the distributor will give you what they want, what you want, and that's when they don't have you. And so just keep that in mind. And I won't say who it was. I was helping him with the distributor, and they were playing hardball. He ultimately got what he wanted because they wanted it. He probably called me 10 times. It probably took 6 months, but he got it because they wanted it. And just keep that in mind. When you have something they want, you'll get it.
Yeah, and before Marc, John, I just want to reiterate or stress that point. Maybe stated another way is you lose almost all your leverage once you sign that agreement. So what you had, your leverage before you sign that agreement. So that is the time to negotiate.
Yeah, and I think even more importantly than that, and I think it's been touched on, and I love the way Fred phrases it, like love the one you're with, because I think a lot of self-analysis needs to go into, a lot of self-discovery needs to go into, why does the relationship bad? Why do I want out? More importantly, why are my sales and my distribution down? And the uncomfortable part of this conversation is, you gotta look in the mirror and ask yourself, what am I doing? Is it really the distributor's fault, or is there something I am or I'm not doing? And I always say this phrase too, every distributor sucks, right? It's not even an elephant in the room, it's just a reality, because no one's ever truly happy at their distributor. Budweiser's not happy with their distributors, you have these relationships, and that's where my philosophy comes in. For me, it's all about relationships. You have these great relationships with your retailers, they want to buy your beer. What's your relationship with the person that's literally buying your beer? You don't have 60 accounts in a market when you're with a distributor. You have one. You're selling beer to a distributor. You're not selling beer to Albany, Illinois, or whatever, if you're with a distributor under those regards. So the fair market thing, I think, again, becomes self-discovery. Like, why do I want out? Who's really going to pick up my brand? And if you're looking to make a move because things aren't going well, what's going to be seen? I think there's, due to the pros and cons, there's a clear checklist. Why am I moving? What's the benefit? Because what's going to happen is if somebody does want it, if it's not going well, and the distributor says, well, we really want you, and it comes down to those contracts, remember the most important things is contracts are negotiable, right? We've had that conversation repeatedly. Like, read through it, get with your lawyer, make changes, negotiate the shit out of it, send the message, like, I'm not just signing this thing to sign it and get on and start selling beer. Read through it, do some homework. It's your brand, it's your baby. Does that answer your question at all?
No, a lot. More specifically, if we wrote a guaranteed multiplier into the first contract, that is enforceable?
Sure, yeah. I don't see any reason it wouldn't be.
Okay.
Well, let me ask a question. I would answer that, and I'll let the lawyers shoot me in the head, but I would say yes and no. So Manhattan Beer is, 50 million cases. We do 250,000 cases with them. If Manhattan Beer doesn't want it, I don't have a contract with them, but if they didn't want to enforce the contract with me, they got a lot more financial wherewithal to stick to this and make my life miserable I'm personally, sorry guys, I'm not wasting my money on legal fees. And so if they show up with their zillion lawyers, and now I gotta call up Marc Serini, who's our lawyer, at $990 an hour, I don't want to deal with that, and I'm not gonna spend the money.
There's a
So,
lot of cases.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I will say that I do think that oftentimes business, with almost, this is true of many, many things, that regardless of what the agreement says, what legal rights and obligations are, a business deal is almost always the best way to resolve those things, and that's, that's the way that the couple of distribution agreements that I've advised clients on terminations on, that's how they were ultimately resolved, was, under the statute, the brewery has the right to make a good faith and an obligation to make a good faith estimate for what the fair market value is if it's not otherwise specified. So what we did in one instance, what the client did, is basically, sent the distributor. This just was a relationship that just wasn't working for a variety of reasons. It wasn't a high volume, so they just sent them a check and said, here it is, and felt that it was just enough that the brewer, the wholesaler wasn't going to want to litigate over it. And that resolved the issue, which was fortunate, because it was going to be a lot more expensive if it had to actually go to full arbitration.
I think that's a key point. Like, even if your contract defines multiple in it, there's still the real world out there. You can usually resolve it for less than that, as long as you find that threshold where they don't want to either go through the expense of bringing arbitration against your brewery, or the public perception of, holding a craft brewer to the fire. Maybe they have other craft brewers, maybe they don't want to ruin their reputation in that area. But there are things you can do to get around it. Any contract can be modified after it's been written. Could they stick to their guns and hold you to it all the way to the end if they really wanted to? Yes, but any lawyer will tell you almost nothing ever goes to trial. Right? It's extremely rare. Almost everything settles. So, and especially if things are going down, in most cases, you're going to be the tiniest fraction. With Fred being one exception, where he's a slightly bigger, tiny fraction. But you're going to be the tiniest sliver of their portfolio. So it may not be worth it. I've had breweries get out for 0x, just because the distributor was cool about it and they didn't want to go through the hassle and it wasn't worth it. So you can, even if your contract says it, there's still hope.
Yeah, and just one thing to your client who wrote the check, the one time we did that recently, just make sure the guy who's getting the beer is going to write the check back to you. So that, I don't know if your client did that, but we made the switch. The guy gave me the money and then I wrote the check. So it wasn't not that I don't trust the distributors, but I didn't want to pay them, it was $400,000 and then not have my money back.
And so I'm not sure that this is the same issue, but it reminds me that this is another thing. If you're terminating a relationship and entering into a new relationship, which there's some issues there that you should always think about in that context too, that your lawyer should advise you on. But sometimes, although I personally have not had this happen, but I do know it happens, is if your new distributor you may be able to get those guys to settle between themselves rather than you having to do it, or you to come up.
That's easier.
Right, for them to buy you out of your existing contract, essentially, like cable companies fighting over your
Sometimes
business.
that's the easy way, but oftentimes when that happens, you could be one piece of their total play. So controlling your own negotiations and getting out with the 55C clause often puts you in an advantage. I like what you said, Fred, is if you have another distributor that's willing to buy you out of that contract with the initial, having that money in hand allows you to negotiate now in good faith with the other. If you allow the two to negotiate with each other, you'll see that other brands may be bartered at the same time, and you start getting lost in the shuffle. So be careful of that.
Yep.
I'm sort of curious, I'm an attorney, we've negotiated, I've never done a fee arbitration, or it's never come to that. I'm sort of curious, and people ask me all the time, like, well, how do they go, and might I do better? But I have no actual, have you guys done the fee arbitration?
No, I have not. Like I said, I've been fortunate enough to never actually have to go through that part because it's expensive. I mean, especially the way it's written. I mean, it's a American Arbitration Association 3-panel arbitration. I mean, that's a trial. I mean, might as well go to court with that. So it's not it's an RO arbitration. I mean, to the extent that's an alternative dispute resolution, this is the most expensive form of alternative dispute resolution there is. So no, I have not done that, and I think you'd have to have pretty high stakes, that fair market value number is pretty big. Most of my brewery clients are pretty small, and the distribution agreements they were trying to get out of were for territories where they weren't doing a lot of volume. So there just wasn't enough money at stake that anybody I think would want to do that.
I've done one last year, actually, pretty recently, where the contract had a 7x multiple written into it, which was rough. And the distributor wanted to make an example out of them. So we made our fair market value payment, which was in the 6 figures, and they filed an arbitration against us. And it didn't get too far. We got a mediator prior to the substance of the dispute going on, prior to discovery, motion, and the mediator was able to work it out and got out for a very fair amount compared to the contract called for. But yeah, that's the only time it's happened in 8 or 9 years I've been doing this, so it's very rare.
Yes, I know that obviously all contracts are dependent on the situation, but are there any specific legal requirements within the contracts that have to be in there for distribution? Or can you give a brief overview?
Yeah, I mean, the statute actually specifies, I mean, although in fairly general terms, so again, the 55C in the ABC says there has to be a written contract, and it has to address, and the language of the statute, it has to do a couple things. One, it has to conform to Section 55C, which defines some of the terms itself, which again tend to be more protective of the distributor than you. So that's one thing. The contract has to be consistent with the statute, and also it has to set forth all essential and material terms, requirements, standards of performance, and conditions of business relationship between the brewer and the wholesaler. What does that mean? I mean, that I think is subject to negotiation of what the parties determine to be those material requirements and terms. But the statute does restrict. Maybe the better way to answer that question is the statute itself sort of restricts some of the things you can do in that contract. Some of that has to do with the assignability of the contract by the distributor part, which is unfortunate. That's one of the Section 55C that makes it pretty easy for the distributor to be able to assign your contract to somebody else. You're not without rights completely there, but regardless of what your agreement says, the statute's gonna, that again has to be consistent with that written. That's just an example of one thing. I mean, the 55C is a fairly lengthy provision of the ABC law that walked through a number of those things that the contract has to be consistent with and the contract has to address.
I don't know if you can get it today, but I'd answer your question this way: is that in the olden days, you wouldn't do a contract unless you had sales goals, distribution goals, spending goals, etc. I have not seen a contract today that will make any commitment whatsoever by the distributor. So, I'd say to your question, there's legalistically, legalese, there's got to be stuff in there, but there's no distributor that's putting anything in there that they're making any commitment that they don't do just on a normal basis.
Yeah, I mean, their standard agreements are, exactly what you'd expect. They're very favorable to them, and they are very general in terms of what their obligations are going to be. And And then that gets to another issue that I think we need to keep in mind when we're doing these things is trying to define what those material terms are and those business terms are that are really important to you, and to try to negotiate those into the agreement, or even preferably, I think, because those things maybe like to evolve over time into a sort of schedule to the agreement that can be revisited from time to time. But all those things that Fred mentioned that are really important for your business plan and your growth plan and your strategy plan, to make sure it's consistent with what, with the agreement's consistent with those plans and goals, because their standard form is not going to contain any of that.
Yeah, one thing I would say is that, and I forget who said it, but somebody said, like, really wisely, you only have leverage at the beginning of the relationship before you sign that contract. And they're going to tell you, oh, we're going to split point of sale costs with you. We're going to, you're going to come in ride-alongs. We're going to, meet these thresholds. If that stuff's not in the contract, it doesn't matter, because the contract, every contract in the world, is a clause at the end that this contract is the complete set of terms between us. Any prior oral negotiations, blah blah blah, is like null and void. It doesn't matter anymore. So if they're promising you anything, they can promise it in the contract. Because otherwise it's not going to matter. And to that point, like Mark, being on both sides of it, like, what would you want to see in a contract? Like, what types of performance metric, or not a performance metric, like maybe it's code guidelines or first in,
Well, I
first
want
out.
right now, after 35 minutes of talking, like most people in this room, so I want to run out of this room right now. That's all I'm trying to do. Like, I think we need to do the mental health check seminar after this meeting. It's exhausting. What would I want to see? I mean, the reality is, to what you're saying, is it's frankly, I don't know how else to put this, but just bullshit, right? Because you can't guarantee anything that is in that contract. You're just doing the best you can to protect yourself with the multiples, if that's what's important to you, the sales and distribution goals and point of sale costs, if that's what's important to you. What do I want to see? I don't know, it's a difficult question to answer, right? Because at the end of the day, you have a vision of what you think it's going to be like when you go to market, and then reality slaps you in the face when you actually have to go out and actually start selling this liquid that you're so proud of in an extremely crowded field. And the distributors are frankly not taking on as many brands as they used to. In fact, they're chopping a lot. Maybe there's a waiting period. Maybe because there's so many of us now, maybe the contract you don't have to worry about as much. It's just buy your time. Because eventually, I mean, I won't mention names, but we were at a point where we were letting people go because it just wasn't working, and we got it. And I hate to say it, but we knew there was nobody else interested in the brand. So where do we go from here? I need more shelf space for the extra SKUs coming in from the next brewery that I've got assigned to make up the sales volumes on that. So I don't have a great answer because it's impossible to answer that question, right?
So I think one thing is get a spending commitment, because make them put their money where their mouth is. And when they give you the spending commitment, so let's say it's $1 a case for argument's sake, and we always match it. Make that spending commitment, so don't say we'll do $1 a case. Make it $1 a case on 50,000 cases. So they are locked in at $50,000 and make it 2-3 years. So it's 50,000 this year, the goal next year is 60, next year is 70, so they're making a commitment of all those legally. So you've got a legal commitment on spend, which they can't get out of, and they'll try, trust me. And then I would go for sales and distribution goals, and one of the things we always did was, we said, well, what's your most successful launch that you did in the last 6 months or the last year? How many on-premise points of distribution did you get? How many off-premise? They always brag, so they pick a brand that's their best brand, and that's a benchmark you can work off of. So you say, okay, you had 100 on-premise and you had 50 off-premise. That's what I want. So get some commitments from them, get them on things that you know that they can do. But again, we haven't been doing that. We haven't made any distributor changes, so I don't know if that works now or not. I'd certainly try.
Like what you're talking about with like writing that into the contract, like if the distributor doesn't fulfill their end of the contract, like how would you approach that, and like would that give a little bit more of the leverage back to the manufacturer?
Yeah, I mean, I would approach it by informing them, saying, you know, here's the section of the contract where you're supposed to do this, you're not doing it. I mean, ultimately, you're not going to, almost in any world, like sue your distributor or win or anything like that. But if it gives you, the reason you put it in there is to give you an out. So either you can use that to terminate for cause, which is still very tough. Which is why, you know, the efforts of like David and the Brewer Association got the fair market value buyout in there. Terminating for cause is going to be impossible even if you have a great contract, because they have 90 days to cure and this whole rigmarole you have to go through, which is basically means the contract's lasts forever. But you can use it as leverage to lower your buyout payment. You can say, hey, we'll stay here if you want, but you have to, the contract says you have to do this, this, and this. So you got to assign, 2 more people to our account, and you got to spend this much on point of sale materials, and you got to do whatever else the contract says. Or you could just let us go, and we'll be free to self-distribute or go to somebody else. So it's a leverage point. I mean, there's probably no world in which you're going to sue your distributor over not meeting some sales goal, but it's a way to either pressure them to get back on track, or just say, these guys are too much of a pain, I'm gonna let them go without a buyout, or for a very low buyout.
Yeah, I think another part of that is be very careful if they're not meeting the commitments that they agreed to on paper, because they're immediately going to come back and say, well, you were going to do all this shit and you didn't do it, and here's your proof. They've got the emails, they've got the data, they've got the work with schedules. I think I've said it once before, they are armed to the teeth with information, and they've got it all right there ready to whip it out. Right, that's a great one.
I totally agree with all of that, and what Brenda was saying is, again, even if you can establish cause, as grounds to terminate, which is, the statute allows you to do that, but it does define this whole rigmarole, this rather extensive procedure that allows them to cure opportunities. But I still think it's important to put that stuff in the contract for the same reason Brenda said, they at least give you some leverage in case things go sideways, and in case you've got to try to negotiate your way out of there. But when you do that, that's why it's also important that, again, that standard form that the distributor is just going to give you and ask you to sign is not going to have any of that. And even if it talks about those things in general, it's not going to clearly say that these terms are material. So I think I'd like to try to get that into the agreements to define exactly what those are and then make it clear that those are material, because then it's default, then it's a breach again. Likely you're not going to be able to actually exercise those rights as a practical matter, but you're going to at least have that argument that may help you get out. I guess the bottom is you're still going to end up having to buy your way out probably, but you're going to have more leverage in those negotiations if you can say, look, I have an argument that I can get out of this for nothing because you defaulted on the material terms of this contract. But to Mark's point too, they're going to come back and say, well, you also defaulted.
Laura, quick.
Yeah, I just wanted two things. One, share personal experience on getting in and getting out of contracts. And then the other is to ask a question about that written contract out of New York State. So my personal experience has been that the distributor would not sign anything with any performance numbers in it at all. Refused. No, we won't ever sign that. And so we were left in a position of either not going with the distributor or signing a contract with no performance measures in it for them at all. And they just refused. Just flat out refused. They wouldn't put any numbers in it. And so that was the contract we ended up signing because we did want them to distribute. And there wasn't any negotiability on it because of the power, the power dynamic. Who else are you going to go with, and what are you going to do? So the other part of the experience share is that I was able to get out on the cure, on the good cause, because I was able to get them to put in writing that they were refusing, they weren't going to bother to sell our stuff, right? They weren't going to actually work. And I let it lie for 91 days, and then said, okay, I'm going to exercise the clause. And they're like, no, we have a cure period. And I pointed back to the email 91 days prior and said, well, that was your cure period. And they let us out.
Just out of curiosity, when you were negotiating and you were trying to negotiate the sales numbers, were there other conversations with other wholesalers happening at the same time?
It was a complicated thing for us because we do spirits.
Yeah, okay.
And it was multiple states.
Yep.
So this was in order to secure distribution regionally. And so they knew that I had even less leverage because if I wanted spirits in New Jersey and spirits in New York,
yep.
and I didn't have a lot of options,
yeah.
And they knew that as well as I did. And so I signed for beer and spirits in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, kind of all at once.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it's a unique position.
Yes,
and
yes,
I only ask because I've seen it happen where the trap is someone comes knocking on my door, that looks really sexy to me, let's go, without exploring other options. That was the only reason why I had asked. I don't know that anybody would have agreed to sales and distribution goals, but I think my point is go ask other people.
yeah.
There's no reason not to. If someone's knocking on your door and they're interested, let's see if anybody else is interested.
And we definitely need to ask. I mean, we definitely drafted it that way, and the lawyer sent it that way, and said,
Yeah.
here are the things, and they redlined it and said, no, thank you. And we went back and forth several
I
times.
forgot the spirits part of the component.
So the question to our lawyer friends up there is like in writing, the sort of distribution in writing. Is that, I'm guessing, as a state-by-state thing, but
Yes.
is it? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. New York is not all states require it. Remember, a lot of states, if they don't have that requirement, then this is, that relation, those beer franchise laws really begin to protect the distributor. One state, you send in their beer, distributor, there's not a written agreement. Now you've got an agreement, and the agreement is that beer franchise law.
Yeah.
And you're stuck with it.
Common law marriage type.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Yep. So, I just wanted to comment again, I mean, to Mark's point again, and to Fred's point, I think about loving one you're with, I think is the right message, important message. But then I just want to stress that make sure you love that person before you sign on that dotted line. In other words, do your due diligence on these people. If you can, that's a red flag to me for somebody who, I mean, look, distributors are difficult to deal with, and it's hard to extract concession out of them. They're just not going to negotiate on anything. I would certainly want to make sure I'm talking to see what my other options are before I just sign an agreement with where they're giving me nothing, or they're giving you nothing. So I think that even before you get to the point of trying to negotiate, or maybe even more important than negotiating those terms, is to make sure this is the company you want to be married to, at least for that territory or for that product, by learning as much as you can about their business, and how do they do the retailers like them? What's their reputation among the people that they're selling these brands to? What's the reputation with the other craft brewers that you all have great relationships with? Just talk to each other about this stuff before you enter into these contracts, because we've made abundantly clear they're hard to get out of. And then one other thing on the spirits issue, I just wanted to mention, or for those of you who sell multiple different products, again, these beer franchise laws are beer specific for the most part. So think about if you're selling multiple products with a distributor, you might want to think about separate agreements governing the different products, because you don't necessarily want your spirits and your wine tied up in an agreement that's really framed around beer franchise agreements, if you're not bound by those for those other products, which is something that
My understanding is that with the spirit stuff, the contracts are just like a regular contract, that there's no.
right, there's not
franchise
those
law.
statutory protections in there as strong. That's why, if you keep that spirit contract separate, you can probably be more negotiable and not stuck with some. Not much easier to get out.
Cider tip in the back.
Yeah, are performance metrics common at all? Would small breweries have any chance of injecting performance criteria in these contracts?
No. Unless you're like super hot, or like
Saturated
finance, or like the other half, or like you have that negotiation power,
Yeah,
maybe.
I tried.
Or a person sitting.
That's right. I mean, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, and it's the nature of this business, as I'm sure all of you know, in this industry, that there's the hot brewery, there's the hot, that, you know, that's the time you might be able to get it, but I haven't been successful in getting real strong performance obligations on the part of the distributor in there. But I think it's good to have that discussion with the distributor. First of all, try to get in there, but also even just having those negotiations, I think you'll get a sense of how committed they are to your product.
The due diligence was brought up, and that I can't stress that enough. If you're thinking about entering a market, if you're thinking about a distributor at all, spend a day or two in the market, talk to the retailer, ask them who they prefer to work with, why, look at their portfolios, just do yourself a favor. And you may even discover this market's just not going to work at all.
And call another small brewery in the portfolio.
Other breweries within that distributorship.
You got 400 of us, call around, pick up the phone, ask, what do you like, what don't you like?
What's up?
500 of us.
It was 503, Paul.
How would you compare our franchise laws to other states?
That's a good question. I have not actually. I've only dealt in New York, so I'm only familiar with the other states' laws by general knowledge about what those are like. I think that there's some worse ones out there than New York, particularly states that you can't self-distribute. So at least the fact that we can self-distribute in New York gives us some leverage that you wouldn't otherwise have, because if you just can't find a distributor who's going to give you decent terms, or it doesn't seem like they're going to be easy to work with, assuming you have the capacity to do it, you always at least have that right. So that certainly helps, and not all states have the no-cause termination for smaller breweries that New York was able to negotiate next
So we're in a bunch of states. What I tell you is just be careful when you go in a state like Connecticut. You're screwed forever. So due to club rights, we have problems figuring out who the distributor is because it goes back so many years. And Virginia is basically a forever state. Maryland is a son of a bitch of a state. Massachusetts has gotten okay. Jersey's okay. Pennsylvania's okay. Just know what you're getting into before you give your rights away.
I would say New York is like top 90th percentile as far as distribution laws. One state that's great is Maine, because they've written in the multiplier for into the law. I forget exactly what it is, but it's set up where if sales are going down, multiples like 1x or something like that. If sales are going up, maybe it's like 2 or 2.5, something like that. But I mean, that's something I'd love to see. But New York is.
If you're really curious about those things, or if you're looking to expand into other states, a good place to at least start and rely on this, but the VA actually has a summary of all of the states' beer franchise laws that they maintain on the website. It's very. I quickly looked at that before this presentation, just because in anticipation, because of that question. But I'm by no means an expert in those other states.
So there's one way to get a distributor to invest in your brand is if you leave a fair market value, that distributor then pays for your brand and now they're invested in your brand. Okay, that's one way. Have you heard of instances where there are breweries that are asking for money up front to come into a market, other than that tire in Belgium? Are there other breweries that do that?
In Belgium, we always did it. We're not expanding, but we always got upfront money before, upfront commitments, as I said. So in Belgium, handling us always said, you're going to spend, ours was $3 a case year one, two, second year, $1 the third year in perpetuity.
So if you're a hot brand and you're being sought after by a distributor, you should ask for money.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
When you ask me what the number one thing I do is I get a number, $1 per case, and a number that they've locked to. So you know they've got to spend $50,000. And then you sit down with them and you say, okay, how are we spending this $50,000? And you got to be careful on that, because they'll say, I put you in live at 5 and they put one tap on and I had to pay $10,000 to get you in. So I'll hold the chest piece.
And I've had, out of like dozens of these contracts, I've had maybe like one or two where it was their first distribution contract and the distributor paid them for the rights. And in every case, it was something where they self-distributed for a while, built up their own retail accounts. So there was already a fair market value for those rights. And the distributor just coming in and taking those, and they pay. I mean, it's rare. It's like getting them to put distribution or sales goals into the contract. Not that level of rarity, but it does happen, and it should happen, because the second you sign that contract, you try to get out of it, they're going to say, you have to pay us to get out. So it shouldn't have value before you sign it, if that's the case.
And that is, that point, I never tried this, because frankly, it hasn't come up, but again, I think it'd be hard to get. But because you do have those self-distribution, those are worth something. And if they're going to take those away, and depending, you don't have to, you can reserve those to yourself in your agreement. But if you're going to, that can be built into the agreement of the fair market value, being credited at the other end if you get terminated. I mean, again, they may not agree to that, but it is something that has value.
I just underscored it. So you always want what you don't want, what you don't have. Where you can self-distribute, I'd self-distribute as long as you possibly can. Those rates are cool. The distributor will tell you, I'm not going to pay you anything. That's bullshit. If they want you, they'll pay. And that the guy I was just referring to is a New York State Brewer. It took him 6 months to get what he wanted, but he got what he wanted because he hung tight. And they started off with, I'm not giving you anything. I won't charge you for the cases if you want to leave later. It's all bullshit. Ultimately got exactly what you want. And I can't tell you, there's probably at least 10 phone calls of, Fred, should I just do this? And I'm like, no, just fucking hang in there. So just, your rights are gold. And we've sold our distribution rights when we got out of distribution. Brooklyn sold their distribution rights when they got out. Anybody I've known, Harpoon, just sold theirs to Deutsche Beverage in Boston, for a lot of money. You want those distribution rights are worth something.
Does the situation change if your contract has been somewhat dormant, or like they're getting picked up in 10, 11, 12 months? Sort of these far out states that yes, fair market value, but obviously keeps going down every day that they don't. But is it just do you have any tips of is it easier to get out of those things? Is there a way to handle that different than a gunfight going with these guys that your bread and butter?
So what we do is we did this in Florida 3 years ago because localization wasn't working. I just had one of our people pick up the phone, call the distributor and say, listen, we're not doing shit down here. We haven't sold in 6 months. We're pulling out of the state. We want to clean up our situation. Every single release. They have egos. So when you get, they go, I'm not giving up any words. And, you even had ones that are a little dicey. They just say, listen, we haven't done our job. We haven't done this. We haven't done this. We haven't done this. It's been hard for you to be successful. We're just getting out of it. And they get their ego so it's not up here. Bring it down here so that you're not insulting them and saying, you suck.
Right. Would you recommend claiming to pull out of the state first before just going to another distributor? Like, don't offer to just go to
I mean,
somebody.
I wouldn't lie. So I haven't, you know, it's, at the end of the day, you got to do the right thing. So, you know, in the case, so I should split those. Where we're Florida, we pulled out. So I just want to clean it up. I'm not telling you I'm not going back in there 2 years, 3 years from now. I just want to go back. I want to clean slate. In another state, we'll call up, like we just cleaned up Connecticut, and that's a dicey state. So we just called up and said, listen, you guys haven't been doing anything. We haven't been doing anything. We're going to consolidate into this one little guy, and they will. Honesty is the best policy. Just don't tweak your ego. Just if you would pale yourself and say you were the bad guy, and they give you what you want, who cares?
I do think that there's a good chance. I mean, if it really is just not a relationship that's pretty small to both sides, it just doesn't work out. I think there's a good chance that, you know, but that was kind of the one situation I was referring to earlier, where we ended up just buying our way out for essentially a nominal sum, because they just weren't willing, for whatever reason. It was, I guess, to them it was just enough to at least, you know, not just let us walk away. And they, of course, came in. You know, they came in. We were off by an order of magnitude in terms of the fair market value we approached it. So we just ended up sending in what we thought it was, and essentially they were able to not cash that check. Go to arbitration, and they opted to cash the check.
One little tip I would give there is that, and I have breweries all the time say, I haven't sold anything for 12 months. Can I say the fair market value is zero? The one tip I would give there is make sure you're, like, you can't, like, fake it. So I've had multiple distributors come back to my client and say, well, we tried to place an order in December and you never sent us anything. So even if it's like an email now and then, like, if you don't really mean it, like, hey, like, we're still here, like, you want to place any orders? And, like, presumably you won't get a response. But now you've got an email where you've made an effort and they still haven't sold anything, and they can't say that you were purposefully tanking the fair market value. That would be one thing.
How does radio silence play in that? Like, where can both of us say anything?
Well, that's what I think Brenda's saying. It's best for, don't allow there to be complete radio silence. You know, do what I think what Brenda's suggesting is absolutely the right thing to do, is at least, hey, remind, I mean, they're not,
You know,
they're
go the other way. I mean, we had a situation with a different brand that we had in Florida where it wasn't working. And I ended up talking to the president of the organization. And we actually, he said, listen, I don't want to do this. I think we haven't done a good job. Blah, blah, blah. Failed ourselves. And now we're crushing it. And so we got their attention. And we thought, we said, next time, so we went in. It's love with one you with. It's communication is key. And Marc said, great, I always like to look in the mirror and say, yes, one of your team members or whatever, and you look in the mirror first, and I look at it and say, well, shit, we didn't train well, we didn't do this, we didn't do this, you know, so that you're then a little more measured in how you deal with the situation.
Right over there, it's 5 o'clock, but we're probably around it.
yeah, I'll be around, and certainly anybody happy to chat some more. Thanks for coming.